It is good to be in the house of the Lord this morning. This morning I'm going to do something a little bit odd. I am going to mix a little bit of American history sermon. And it's history that I feel is very important, very relevant, and really expresses God's presence. And it's not even history that far removed. No, saw a lot of things when I was in New York this past week. Learned a lot of things, and there's going to be a few sermons coming out of my trip. This one being the first of which. This morning, I'm talking about that fateful day about 12 and a half years ago. September 11th, 2001. It's a day etched in the memory for many of us, something we'll never forget. A little bit after 9 o'clock in the morning, two planes were overtaken by terrorists and struck the Twin Towers. Less than 2 hours later, these towers fell. Much devastation and death were brought to the city. Over 1,000 people died at this point in time. And for 3 blocks, every building was damaged. Windows shattered, structural damage, you name it. Body parts were found up to 6 blocks away. Now that's something you can really take into context when you're standing there. But there's one specific thing I want to focus on out of that. Have any of you heard the story of the little church that stood? Do you know of St. Paul's Church? Well, I'm going to get to that in just a moment. We're going to go to Psalms this morning. It's going to be the scriptures that I'm going to be looking at. Psalms 9:9. He lurks in a hiding place as a lion in a lair. He lurks to catch the... Oh, sorry, I'm in the wrong chapter. No wonder what I was reading didn't seem right. Psalms 9:9, not Psalms 10:9, what I was just reading. But 9:9. The Lord also will be a stronghold for the oppressed, a stronghold in the time of troubles. Now over in Psalms 46. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth should charge, and though the mountains slip into the heart of the sea. Though its waters roar and foam, though its mountains quake at its swelling pride. Now, how do these passages relate to St. Paul's Church? The little church that stood. They actually wrote children's stories about this and titled it, like I was saying, The Little Church That Stood, around the notion of the little engine that could. St. Paul's Church is located right across the street from Ground Zero. Now there's a miracle at St. Paul's Church on September 11th, 2001. Now I told you every building in 3 blocks suffered damage. Windows were busted, structural damage, with the exception of one. St. Paul's Church, right dead across the street from Ground Zero, did not suffer a single broken window. This became the refuge for the relief workers. An undamaged, perfectly still safe building for the workers that are tending to Ground Zero. It became the base of operations for the firefighters, the police, the emergency squads, at St. Paul's Church. Not a single piece of damage occurred to that church. Think of that. For 3 blocks, we're talking 3 blocks away from that church, buildings suffered structural damage. St. Paul's Church. Not even a single broken window. This isn't even a new church. St. Paul's Church is the church that our first president sat and prayed in. It is one of the oldest standing buildings in the eastern United States. So it's not some massive construction that kept it safe. It's still the original construction. Now, it is undergoing work now because it did suffer some damage during Hurricane Sandy. But on that day, and amidst all that death, all that destruction, the little church stood. This should have been something that the nation took notice of. That God was there in the time of troubles. That God gave a refuge, as He promised He would. Now in Job, it talks about Job being protected. That Satan says, well, maybe I could get him to stray if you would take your protection down from him. This church was protected. Now they try and say that a sycamore tree in front of it absorbed all the debris. Reason says that that's impossible because for 3 blocks away, buildings that were shielded by other buildings were still damaged and destroyed. Yet St. Paul's Church stood. It's hard to look at that in any other light than God was present. And God was present, as the psalmist would say, in times of troubles, in times of need. Amen. Because at that point in time, the country and that city were in need, in fear, in hurt. And that little church stood. It's a constant reminder that God is always there for us. Amen. It still stands as a memorial now to 9/11. It is a more impressive memorial to that day than the actual one that they've built, due to the fact there's so many mementos that people have left behind. It's just amazing because you can see God's work was in it. He provided a place that they would be able to work out of, work from. We see it from time to time in disasters. It's just like with us in the tornado. Houses right next to us destroyed. We suffered minor damage. God provides in times of troubles. Amen. Sometimes we don't necessarily see it. Sometimes it's something that is so miraculous, like the little church that stood. To me, this is something that's touched me deeply because it is that awe and awesome wonder of how when right next to it, 2 massive towers fell, debris scattered throughout the city, and this church remained undamaged. They've compared the Twin Towers falling and the damage around it to the equivalent of a bomb detonating. Yet this little church right across from where that bomb would have detonated was totally and completely undamaged. God saying, here I am in your midst, giving you protection still. Also, should stand as a reminder because, like I said, this is one of the oldest standing buildings in the eastern United States. It is the church where many of our founding fathers sat and prayed. It should be a call for us as a nation to return to those morals, those values that were set forth. God's reminder in the midst of this that God is still here. But God will never leave us. He is our refuge, no matter what is going on in our lives. Like I said, this church stands as a lasting one. But in our lives, we always still have that refuge in God. No matter where we are, no matter what is going on, God is always with us.
Amen.
He will never leave us, nor will He forsake us. The psalmist, even over in Psalm 62, continues in the same line of thought. My soul waits in silence for God only. From Him is my salvation. He only is my rock and my salvation. My strongholds, I shall not be greatly shaken. When we trust in God, when we use Him as our stronghold, as our refuge, then our lives are not so easily shaken. Our lives are able to continue to stand. It's remembering that no matter what goes on in this world, it's temporary, it will pass away. God is our stronghold, our refuge. He will provide for us. He will take care of us. It's easy to get caught up in worries in all of our daily lives, but we're told God provides food for the birds of the air, clothes the grass in mighty wonder and splendor. Won't He provide so much more for us? Are we not much more than birds or grass? That we should let our worries fall not on these needs, but seek first God's righteousness. We should strive to be like that little church that stood. Be that refuge that stands out in the face of destruction, that refuge that stands out in the midst of hard time. Be that bastion of light, saying that God is here. He still cares. He will not leave us. He will not forsake us. He will not turn His back on us. Letting our lives stand in such a way that people see God in us. And that our lives touch other people. Just as the story of that church touches so many people when they hear it and they understand it. They say the greatest witness is when a person is going through hard times. And that is often true, to see a person that is suffering with cancer, going through chemo on their last legs, yet they still stand up and say, God is with me, and give God the glory, regardless of what happens. It's that giving all to God that stands as such a great witness. Letting people see that God is still there, that He is still with us. I thought I would run a little bit longer this morning, but I believe I've said a lot in a shorter period of time than I normally do. But still, for me, that's one of the things that stood out in awesome wonder. It was just the little church that stood. For me, those churches and visiting those was something special. I'll even talk a little bit about St. John's Cathedral. I'm sure some of you saw a lot of the pictures and stuff I put up, but that's an amazing place as well. With St. John's, during the AIDS epidemic in the early 80s, when hospitals were turning AIDS victims away, and people believed that if you breathed the same air as an AIDS victim, that you would contract it as well. St. John's turned their basement into a hospice for all these AIDS people that were being turned out of hospitals and that nobody wanted anything to do with. There's great love that you can see in these churches that were there. But that is all I have to say for this morning. Maybe someone has something they'd like to add in, or just a different way of looking at things. Now would be your time.